At FIE, we're not just
students
and faculty.
We're not only learners
and lecturers.
We are expanding minds,
Expanding futures.
We're redefining the classroom.
We are life-changing.
eye-opening. We are a community
Driven by our values.
That wants you.
you.
Yes, you.
To join.
Hello and welcome to In the Field, a podcast from FIE, where we will be exploring all things study abroad. I'm Dr. Heidi James Dunbar, writer in residence and faculty, and I will be your host. Today's episode is all about storytelling, why it matters, how it influences student decisions, and how it can transform the study abroad experience. I'm joined by two fantastic guests, Chris Arnold, founder of Made Impact, who's on a mission to prove that international exchange is the world's best strategy for prosperity, peace and progress, and Dr. Maureen Manning, founder of the Global Nexus Collective, a leader in international education with deep experience in shaping and amplifying the voices of the field. Chris, Maureen, hi, welcome to the show. So to kick things off, I'd love to start simple. How do each of you define storytelling in the context of study abroad?
You go first, Maureen, please.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I mean, storytelling for me, I'm going to put my educator hat on. It's a process of helping students and institutions make those connections between experience and meaning. So for me, it's all about the meaning making that comes from experiences. So it's not just about documenting where students travel, which I think we see a lot of, but it's helping them articulate how their global experiences shape their identity, their perspective, their relationships, their career readiness, and their ability to navigate complexity.
I would just say, in terms of it's okay to live in the moment and just enjoy an experience. But one of the reasons you go on study abroad is to figure out how that's going to evolve you as a human and how you're going to flourish. If you can't appreciate or understand or articulate the story that you've created for yourself, it's not going to help you get a job, or it's not going to help you decide what you would like to do in the future. It's not going to help you evolve. So that's why storytelling in study abroad is crucial, not just from a marketing perspective.
Chris, I'm glad you brought that up, because working with institutions and organizations on their storytelling techniques and campaigns, et cetera, is central to the work that we do here at the Global Nexus Collective. And I think sometimes when people hear that word storytelling, they assume that it means marketing, when really it's about interpretation and meaning making. And it helps translate information and transformation into something that others can really understand and connect with on an emotional level. And so I think one of the reasons why storytelling is particularly important to our field is because study abroad can often be difficult to quantify, or the impact of study abroad can often be difficult to quantify through numbers alone, right? We have lots of measurements, and you and I have talked about this extensively, but we have lots of measurements when we're talking about retention, graduation rates, employability rates, et cetera. But storytelling helps capture that emotional connection to the experience in a way that quantitative data alone simply cannot.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to be honest, while you try really hard through the Nexus Collective to make sure marketing's a good thing and people do it well, and lots of people put resources into storytelling, frankly, and to be controversial, because I feel like that today, I don't think many people tell stories particularly well in the study abroad sector or in international exchange and education as a whole. I think it's we've talked about it lots. There are people who mention, oh, we should tell our story better. And I've heard that for decades and not seen too many concerted efforts to fully understand what that means and how that could revolutionize study abroad or improve a business or an institution. So I don't think we're good storytellers. I think there are isolated pockets of excellent storytellers, but as a whole, as an average, I think we're a little bit rubbish.
I could not agree with you more. And that has long been one of my central gripes about the field is that I think we're, as a field, we're half decent at telling our stories to ourselves. But we're already sold, right? Like if you're telling me a story about the importance of education abroad, I'm already there. I've bought into this. I understand this full well. But it's telling our stories beyond that sector that I don't think we're good at, right? We all go to a lot of conferences and a lot of events, and listen to podcasts, for example, and participate in conversations about the field with others in the field. So getting outside that first circle of influence is so essential. And so that's part of the work that we do. And that's actually what drew me to you, Chris, and to Made Impact, because I saw the scale. And when I realized what all you were doing, in terms of scale and collecting 1 million stories of study abroad and that impact, I wanted to know more. I wanted to get on board. So I don't want to steal your thunder. I'll let you talk about that.
Well, when I say we're rubbish as an industry, I kind of include myself. My previous life and career was leading an international exchange organization that sent young people to summer camp in the US, predominantly from all over the world. And our marketing, our website, our social media, the stories on there were just 20-year-olds jumping off docks into lakes with big smiley faces. And it was so one-dimensional. And we were only selling to one customer, which was the next iteration of young people. Occasionally, we try and encourage parents to get on board. And I think that's the same in study abroad. We narrow the type of stories down to what will get us short-term success. And that means we've lost out on an archive of alumni stories that would be positioned to sell politicians, philanthropists, parents, and participants. And that's kind of a little bit criminal that we haven't coalesced or built a coalition to tell the story of the industry as a whole. I'm on a soapbox. I'm always I go off on one. So
Enter Made Impact.
Well, that's what I think. And if I'm going to just briefly divert the conversation from storytelling to Made Impact as an organization, which is all about storytelling, we're collecting 1 million stories of impact. The idea of that is to have some stories that travel and are interesting and are a little bit different, but it's also about data collection to collect enough evidence that we reposition study abroad and the industry as a whole. And repositioning means that, like I said, politicians, philanthropists, and frankly, the Nobel Peace Prize Committee should take a bit more notice of what we do. And that's what Made Impact are. 1 million stories, Nobel Peace Prize, and then we're going to leverage that to make it the whole industry more accessible to more people.
I'm just wondering what mistakes we're sort of talking about, how institutions often aren't telling the story well, and I'm wondering what some of the more common mistakes are that you see institutions in when they're telling student stories, and how those mistakes can be rectified, and how we better communicate what it is we're doing via using those student stories.
For me, I think when the narrative is overly curated and they become, like Chris said, the student jumping off the dock into the lake. I mean, great. I'm not saying that there's no place for it, but we're missing something when we are exclusively producing these overly polished student stories to the point where they almost no longer feel authentic. I mean, AI could do some of that. What I'm looking for and what attracts me in around storytelling is when they go beyond the surface level travel type narrative, and when they get into the discussion of the learning or the challenge or the growth. So that's one piece of it. I think the other piece for me where institutions or organizations make mistake is when they unintentionally center the traveler and sometimes can overlook the host community, the local perspectives. So those are two areas for me where I think could be strengthened.
I completely agree with that. Well, I agree with both points there, Maureen. The lack of authenticity sometimes just screams off the website or out of YouTube. It's just like there's a script. And I know people get nervous in front of cameras or on podcasts, as we all do, but it's kind of, don't just drift into this scripted world where you can only say positive things. You don't actually give a character arc about how you overcame some of the problems. If we took some hints from the world of professional storytelling, we might be a bit better at it. And by professional, I also mean influencers. How do they tell a story that captures? And to do it, this day and age, we also need to consider that some need to be short form, some can be slightly longer, but they all need to be edited pretty well. But you don't need an expensive camera to do it. You just need a phone. And it really is authentic when people seem to have those candid moments. So I think it's overly scripted, overly curated. I think that's a big problem. I also think we make the mistake of thinking young people are interesting by default. I think they tend to be pretty good looking 21-year-olds. It's annoying as a 53-year-old. It's frustrating, but they are not necessarily that interesting. I would personally rather a lot more effort go into the capture of alumni stories where there's a little bit of gap from the experience. So you studied abroad in 1987. Tell me how you remember that being and where it took you for the next 40 years. I'd rather hear that story than a 21-year-old say, oh, do you know what? It was so good. And I saw the Colosseum. Great. Well, that's nice.
Yeah, I think in those, sometimes that's where we get the full circle moments that you simply do not get with a recent study abroad participant.
How do students tell their stories in a way that is beneficial to them? How do they articulate their experiences? And I'm also really interested in how that creates identity formation, because we are the stories we tell ourselves, right? And we're the stories that we kind of inhabit our own story. So I'm wondering about how we can help students articulate their study abroad experience in consolidating that sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, we know that many, if not most, students who return from study abroad experiences see themselves differently. They become more self-aware, adaptable, globally minded. When we give students the assessments, the pre and post assessments, there is undoubtedly change with the majority of the students. So they're filling out their surveys afterwards, but storytelling allows them to integrate those experiences and those learnings and what they're checking off on their scale into their broader sense of identity and think about their future directions. I think you really hit on something, Chris, when you said, coming back to folks years later, decades later, and talking to them about their experiences. And I think some of the best storytelling campaigns or initiatives or efforts involve both those recent students who recently had an experience as well as students who had that experience in 1987 and able to make those connections in a different way with a different lens. But I think allowing time for reflection for both quantitatively and qualitatively through survey and through story, that's the sweet spot.
Yeah, I do agree. I like the idea of stories being captured in the moment, actually on program, and then doing it at regular intervals, starting with the immediate assessment of how it went, and then maybe a year, then 5 years, then 10 years, just to have some kind of commitment and almost a study. It's a study of study abroad that we require. And that longitudinal approach to storytelling, that would be super interesting. And when you mention identity, I think one of the things that we should be looking for storytelling to do, or stories to do, is to trick young people. I'm just being frivolous with my words. Trick young people into saying things that they then have to deliver. So let's get them to tell a story. Let's feed them with some things. Oh, this feels like it's set me up to be a world leader, and then help them to become a world leader. So I do think the identity thing, if you have something on camera, the negative side of it is social media can ruin a young person nowadays. I'm so lucky I didn't grow up with that. And people are really worried and conscious about it. But the other side of it is, get some positive stuff up online where they say how they feel more confident and stronger to attack their career or their ambitions, and then hold them accountable to that stuff as a university or as an institution. That'd be a fun exercise to see if you could figure out how you could mold their identity around positive experience.
I love that. And I have an idea to that end. But two things, the two words that come to mind as you're just saying that, Chris, for me are manifestation and mentorship. So something about the act of saying, when we ask students in their reflection or in an interview of what will you do now? So how has this experience changed you? And what do you think you will do now differently as a result of this experience? And what do you see in your life 10, 20, 30 years from now? So there's a bit of manifestation that comes into that when we ask students to see themselves in the future. What are they doing? What does their future hold? What does it look like to them now as a young adult? So there's that piece of it that I find very interesting. And then to what extent are they holding themselves to that, or have they manifested and helped craft, a life of their dreams, if you will? The other piece is mentorship. And so if they're saying like, I want to do this now with my life as a result of this experience, or I did an international internship and met folks in this industry, and now it's sort of shifted my thinking about how I see my career. Can we then use that as an opportunity to make connections for students with people in that field, or help make some of those connections and have some mentorship, be it formal or informal? So those are the two pieces I think that are really interesting about collecting stories in the moment. One other thing I'll add to that is you talk about the longitudinal study. I am so on board with that. In fact, my dissertation involved collecting stories in the moment of students on high school short-term study abroad programs, and then coming back to them years later after graduation or near graduation and seeing how that impacted their college and career choices. I would love to then come back to them decades from now, or 10 years, 20 years from now, and see how it has impacted their life, how it continues to impact their life. So if you are one of my former students, beware, I may be coming to you in about 10 or 20 years.
I like it. You mentioned mentoring, and I think maybe that's another thing that we miss, or a lot of institutions or organizations miss. That often there's some kind of pre-departure preparation that there should be, and there usually is. But how often are people given the task to find mentors? When people go and study abroad, they're usually in that transition phase from youth to adult. They're in that zone, and we're kind of all indoctrinated in the accident of our birth wherever we grow up. I grew up in Liverpool. I support Liverpool Football Club. I'm indoctrinated, and all my mentors are in the same environment I grew up in. Study abroad is maybe the first time for a lot of people to get mentors and insight from people from different backgrounds. And I think we should be challenging students who are about to embark on a journey to collect a matrix of mentors. So who is different to me? Who can teach me about compassion or confidence or communication, whatever it might be, in that land I'm going to? And actually, one of the tasks should be to get the stories of your mentors. You use that as a moment to showcase your travels and your experience. But you're not focused on you, you're focused on the people that you meet because of the experience. I don't see that very often. And for an individual, having that record of who has meant a lot to them, even in some form of brief encounter, that's something that they should keep with them for life. So yes, I do happen to be writing a book called The Mentor Matrix at the moment, but that's a different thing. So the idea of collecting people, though, is collecting connections. What's better than study abroad to collect those and then tell the story of that? It's an incredibly important moment in people's lives, and should be shared.
Speaking, I'm loving all of what you guys are saying, but I just want to sort of think a little bit about how making sure that the stories that we are sharing, the people whose stories we're sharing, remain not exclusive, so that we make sure that study abroad is represented in a way that isn't reliant on stereotypes, that doesn't shut down accessibility, that is ethical and responsible and is promoting as much educational equity as we possibly can. So we're not sort of allowing those new colonizing attitudes to sort of impinge on study abroad, which is something we always have to be aware of. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, or any strategies that we as institutions and providers can be thinking about and employing, because we don't want to kind of reinforce stereotypes, but it is about holding everyone in the same esteem.
No, I was going to say, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think both institutions and organizations need to broaden whose stories are being told and think critically about what stories are left untold and how can we shine a light on those stories. And I think it's done unintentionally, and when institutions or organizations highlight only one type or one or two types of student experiences, and certainly more inclusive storytelling can help prospective students to see that global learning can and does belong to many different identities and backgrounds and pathways. It's so important for students to be able to see themselves in a study abroad program. And in having done research around barriers to study abroad, often the first barrier that people think of is financial barriers. But when you think of a list of barriers that students indicate traditionally and historically over many, many years in many surveys about what are those barriers to study abroad, and practitioners often think, well, it's financial. If only we could have more scholarships for students to study abroad, then more students will go. And financial barrier is not the most difficult to mitigate, right? Because we can find scholarships for many students, and that's a barrier that can be mitigated. The more difficult barrier to mitigate is mindset. And so often that is because students do not see themselves in study abroad. And why don't they see themselves in study abroad programs? Because their stories have not been told. They haven't seen students like them who belong to similar groups and often historically underrepresented communities. So they're not seeing those stories to the extent that they feel that this is something that's accessible to them if all other barriers were mitigated. So I think that's a shift that really needs to be made, is whose stories are we telling and how can we do a better job at inclusive storytelling?
I know we don't want to stereotype any other culture. Of course, we don't. I am going to use one stereotype that I believe, though. I think the upcoming generation is more determined to rail against the stereotypes of the world. That they are quicker to appreciate and believe that those of difference are actually not really different when you get to an emotional human level. That yes, there are different indoctrinations, like I said before, but the students about to embark on study abroad, if they are told, this is maybe a little bit too political, but if they are asked to help defy division on the planet, if they are given the tools to interview other people and to engage in a different way, they're not going on a shallow bout of tourism. They have the opportunity to immerse themselves in a different environment, and that gives them the chance to go past the stereotypes. And we obviously should encourage that and celebrate the stories that they bring back of that, rather than what I think is sometimes just the introspective stories that we see. That's why I'm keen to see them talk on camera to others. It's also a way of growing confidence, because you can hide a little bit behind the idea of an interview. So maybe there's some things that we can specifically set, tasks that we could set as institutions to collect those stories that build the confidence, but also destroy the division. And so, just also to say to Maureen's point about study abroad being well, actually, I think it was my point. Maureen sod off. It was me. I think I said it. It's a key moment in people's lives. I think that we should make sure that they're armed to do this well, and that includes railing against the colonial aspect that we're sometimes accused of promoting by accident. The West is better than wherever. The UK is better than wherever, etc., etc. So I think it's an easy one to overcome. It's just preparation, pre-departure preparation.
So, for any study abroad professionals who are listening, what's one? You've said so many things about how people could improve their storytelling practices, but if there's one simple way that an institution could improve their storytelling, what would it be?
I would say it is connecting the experience to outcomes and helping students better articulate their experiences to outcomes. And again, sometimes this comes with alumni stories, as Chris mentioned earlier, but I think that it is both part of that pre-departure orientation that we just spoke about, as well as the re-entry and the reflection in the time and the space and the tools that we supply students with during that re-entry period. Because we know that reflection is a critical part of intercultural learning. So when students are armed with the tools to better tell their story about experiences, they begin organizing that information about what they learned, what challenged them, how they change in a different way in their brains. And that allows them to better make the connections, which then allows the recipient of that story or the viewer of that story to then make the connections and again, see themselves. So I think in a time where outcomes are essential, demonstrating what the outcomes are of international experiences and higher education as a whole are critical factors during a time in which higher education is under attack in many places, and the value of higher education is being questioned and in these intercultural experiences. So how can we better equip students with the tools, with the storytelling techniques to make those connections about outcomes? I think that's going to be a critical piece.
I think a very practical thing professionals could do to grow the stories, grow the quantity and quality of the stories that come out of study abroad experiences is to make much better use of grand incentives. There's lots that will have, you get a $20 coffee voucher or something. And I just think, well, that's not really going to actually make somebody do something. I think what I learned, I led a global youth movement for a while called World Merit. and it was its whole premise was to reward young people for the work that they did towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and the rewards were, some of them were incredibly attractive. So a trip around the world. Now, I'm not saying institutions should go to that level, but what I am saying is that they should work with agencies like, or not-for-profits like Made Impact, who are hosting a storytelling day in New York at Ellis Island. So the storyteller of the year or the storyteller of the summer gets to go and speak it or show their story off at the United Nations. Well, we could facilitate that. Or if you want to do your own incentive, do something that is a little bit more inspiring than the £50 voucher. Doesn't have to give to everybody. I think just inspiring people to fight for something. I found that really worked at World Merit. We offered a trip around the world and had 44,000 people compete for it. If you offer your 100 participants on study abroad, one of you guys is going to get to the UN next year and tell your story. They'll think a lot harder about storytelling for their whole experience. I can absolutely guarantee it. So incentives are easy to do.
And storytelling is so fundamental to everything that is human, and I think people often overlook that if you're reading an article or a report that's engaging, it's because it's told like a story. We tell ourselves, we understand ourselves the story. Storytelling is vital and crucial, not just in terms of exploring your study abroad experience or engaging students in coming on study abroad. It is really and truly the foundational skill for all of us, right? This has been such a great conversation. You're both incredible, but I'm aware of your time. So I just wanted to wrap us up by asking if you could share one story or a moment that captures why study abroad matters.
Oh, I mean, I'm just thinking of a full circle. There's so many, right, reasons why study abroad matters. It's why I've made it my life's work for 30 plus years. But it all started as with many of our colleagues in the field, it started with that first study abroad experience. And for me, it was at 16 years old in high school during a short-term study abroad program in Ecuador. And it was that moment when I was questioning what I thought I always wanted to do with my life. And I was able to better understand, to the extent that a 16-year-old can, that there was a whole world out there and so many people that I haven't met, so many stories that are waiting to be told, including my own. And it just gave me that curiosity for learning more about the world and its people. And it eventually made me change what I studied. And I ended up halfway through uni taking a gap year to say, like, what I'm studying is not the exact right path for me. And it all went back to me to that first international experience. It was the first time I had been on an airplane. It was my first passport. It was the first for so many reasons. And it was an experience I kept coming back to. And being in a field, I went to uni to study musical theater. I was a born storyteller and knew that I would spend my life in some way telling stories. I thought it would be on stage. And 30 plus years later, I'm here to tell you that it is, and it is on stage, but it's on a different stage than I had imagined. It's not on a Broadway stage. It is on stage at conferences and on podcasts, and it's on telling stories about the power of study abroad, but more importantly, not my stories, but amplifying the stories of students and creating platforms where students have that opportunity to share their stories, to help make connections between professionals in the industry so that we can better tell student stories. So for me, that the full circle moment came just recently at the AIEA conference, and I was in the afternoon chatting with colleagues from Ecuador and sharing my story, and then later that night performing in Dr. Paulo Zagallo's Mello's rock band, where he had asked me to sing a song, and interestingly, it was the same song that I sang at 16 in Ecuador. During a performance. I was there. One of the reasons why we're there, we were doing performances. And so I was performing a song from Greece. And I was able to do that. Now, Paolo had no idea of any of this background story. And that was the song, one of the 2 songs he asked me to sing. And I thought, this is just a beautiful full circle moment of how things are meant to unfold. And I just very much felt that maybe there was a manifestation that happened for me in Ecuador at 16 years old that came to fruition in 2026 February in Washington.
I didn't do study abroad in the traditional sense. I'm one of those, I guess, underprivileged kids. Some would categorize me. I never really was. My mum and dad were brilliant. I was well supported, but I was at a very tough school, and nobody in my environment had ever traveled in that type of way. I mean, genuinely the only time people around me ever seemed to leave the country was to watch Liverpool play away, surrounded by 10,000 other Liverpool fans. It's not really a cultural immersion on any level. So it was never for me. And Maureen mentioned before how important stories are that you can relate to. I hope that if I tell people I'm from the school I'm from, in that school, 40 years later, 35 years later, that they might go, okay, that's something I should try and do myself. Because it took me till I was 21 to go to summer camp through BUNAC, British University's North American Club, went to Minnesota, and that experience changed my life. I just wish it would have been 4 or 5 years earlier. And how it changed my life was, not to be so trite, because we all kind of say it changed my life, but how it specifically did was I was surrounded by people from all over the world for the first time. And I was also became good friends with Harvard and Yale undergrads who were fellow counselors. And they were rich. My God, they had so much money. I was so in awe of how much money they were inheriting on their 21st birthday. And tried to date most of them who were going to inherit millions on their 21st birthday and failed. But what I realized was they're no different. So this story about cultural exchange being an eye-opener, it's not just about the difference of where you were born or the faith that you might follow. For me, it was about that socio-economic difference. Richer people than me were actually quite nice and human and funny and miserable some days. And that was an eye-opener that I only had when I was 21. How ridiculous. So to escape from where you are and contextualize who you are and where you can go, that's the power of study abroad. And that's why doing it slightly earlier than I did would be something I'd recommend to everyone. So, yeah, that's my story.
Chris, Maureen, thank you both so much for such a thoughtful and inspiring conversation. And to our listeners, if there's one takeaway from today, it's this: storytelling isn't just about promoting study abroad. It's about making meaning, building connection, and expanding perspectives. To learn more about our work in providing study abroad education, visit our website, www.fie.org.uk. And if you've enjoyed this episode, check out our others wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thank you for listening. FIE provides life-changing study abroad experiences in the UK, Ireland and Spain. As a non-profit educational organisation, we are passionately invested in making a difference for our students as the future global leaders of tomorrow and the field of international education as a whole. The FIE podcast is a creative and academic space for exploring everything, the people, the places and opportunities that make your experience so valuable and exciting.
FIE, we're here to help you
Unlock a wider
brighter future.